everybody. Welcome to week number 14. Today we're going to be discussing fat. Now, I'm not talking about the soft, squishy stuff around our belly that we're always fighting to lose, but the macronutrient fat. So, to get started, I'll say I think it was a huge disservice to our society when they decided to call the macro fat the same word as body fat. Now, first of all, they are not the same thing, and one does not lead to the other. For a long time, it was taught and kind of thought that to lose body fat, we should keep the macronutrient fat out of our diet. And honestly, that makes sense when you think about it, right? I mean, you think eating fat is going to make you fat, right? But is that really true? Now, the simple answer, of course, is no. The macro fat does not make us fat. It's not the secret evil food that our bodies can absorb extra easily and turn into fat or to lose progress. That being said, there are a couple of things to consider when it comes to consuming the macronutrient of fat. Because while we have gone through this program, you may have noticed that for most of you, I do this for pretty much all my clients, I like to keep the fat the smallest percentage of the macros. And I like to keep, the protein super, super high. The fat, I only go high enough to make sure it's supplementing the joint health and the hormone health. And then I fill up the rest with carbs. And the reason that I keep the fats just high enough to supplement the body, and honestly, there's two kind of considerations of why I do that, and I want to kind of express to you. So for number one, fats do have a much higher calorie count per gram. So if you remember, there's protein, carbs, and fats, right? Those are the three macronutrients. Also alcohol, don't really talk about those. We're mostly focusing on the three. For protein and for carbs, 1 gram of either of those is 4 calories. So for, let's say, an ounce of chicken breast, there's going to be 9 grams of protein, and 9 grams of protein is going to come out to be 36 calories for that protein. Whereas, if we have fats, it's a lot higher. It's 9 calories per gram. So just kind of for an apples to apples comparison, let's say we have 2 ounces of avocado, which is going to be 9 grams of fat. Now remember, 9 grams of protein was 36 calories. 9 grams of fat are over 100 calories. So a lot more than even double the calories. So it's a lot more calorie dense. Now the second reason I kind of keep fats a little bit lower is they are delicious. I'm sure you'd agree with me if you've eaten peanut butter, fries, things that are fried, things that have a lot of fat in them taste amazing. And it's also really hard not to overeat things that have a lot of fat. So when you're filling your diet with lots of foods that are very, very high in fat, it's honestly just really easy to get those calories way too high and to be away from the protein. So one thing that I personally stay away from and try to keep my clients away from is super fatty meat sources or fats that are completely not giving any protein or any carb or anything that's helpful. It's just a pure fat source. And this is mostly because the importance of not overeating calories. So let's kind of look at a little bit of an example between fish and ribeye steak. Now, as you've probably heard a lot, right? Hopefully at this point you've realized that it's very important to get in the correct amount of protein. So for this example, we're going to be using kind of my own needs of macros. I usually eat about 7 meals a day, and each meal I'm shooting for 45 to 55 grams of protein. I have a very, very high amount of protein I try to consume a day. Now, for 5 of those meals, I try to make sure that protein comes from a solid food source, like meat. Now, let's say that this is one of my 0 carb meals. I do have a few of those throughout the day. And so it's primarily going to just be the protein source. Now, this is going to be the difference of a lean whitefish versus a high-fat ribeye. Both of them are going to be getting me to my protein need. So let's look at a halibut. Halibut fish, 8 ounces, that's 51 grams of protein. There's 3 grams of fat, and that is a total of 250 calories. Very, very lean, right? Now let's look at a ribeye steak. Still 8 ounces. This is going to be 56 grams of protein. But instead of 3 grams of fat, there are 43 grams of fat, and that brings the total calories up to 615. So between these two different options, right, each one is getting me to my goal of protein for that meal. But the difference in calories, 615 compared to 250. That there's literally an entire another meal of halibut that you could fit in there and still be under the total calories of just one ribeye steak, right? So that's an entire pound of halibut versus 8 ounces of steak, and it would still be lower and leaner to eat a whole pound of halibut. Now, one thing that is very important here, I am not trying to say that fat is bad. It is very important that we do have fat in our diet. And it is also important to remember that fat is a really, as a food source, is not what makes us fat. It's not the causing the fat. Remember, it's just the high calorie. So, we can kind of move around how much or how little fat we have based off our preference. Now, in general, like I mentioned, I do like to keep fat lower, but it's primarily just because it allows for higher amounts of total food from carb sources. Because, if you're eating, clean carb sources, rice, potato, things that are pretty much just carbs, and a low fat diet, the total volume of food is going to be a lot higher. And for most people, that's going to be the best way to stick with a diet long term and to feel good. They're going to feel satiated, full, satisfied, things like that. Though, that being said, you can totally change around the total amount of fat versus carbs if you have a preference. I have some clients that prefer higher fat, and so I just put them on lower carbs and higher fats. They just feel better that way. I personally also actually feel better on a higher fat diet. When I'm eating foods with higher fats, I just usually feel more satisfied, satiated, and my joints feel really good. That's not everyone though. More people have a preference and feel better on higher carbs. Just kind of something to play around with. So the main takeaway from this video that I want you to remember, fat is very high in calories. So just keep that in mind before you're throwing a ton of fat willy-nilly into your diet. Because if you do throw in a lot of fat, it can be much harder to stay in a calorie deficit or maintenance depending on what you're trying to do. So if you are going to add lots of fats or you really, really like food with fats, try to add those into your calorie counter app earlier in the day so you kind of have an idea of what your whole day is going to look like to make sure you're not overeating. Another thing, though you don't want to go overboard, you do still need fats in your diet. This is not something where you can go, oh, I'm just going to go zero fats because then I can eat more carbs. They are very important to our hormone health and joint health. And especially, this is important for those who lift weights or have a very active lifestyle. So as a rule of thumb, I would not want you to eat less than 70 grams of fat per day. Now, this is a baseline. Obviously, some people are going to function great at lower levels, and others, this is going to be too low. So there are a lot more to know about fats, things like trans fats, saturated fats, unsaturated fats. I'm going to jump into those just a little bit, but I don't want to go too deep just because, we don't have another 30, 40 minutes to dive super deep into this. But in general, this is just kind of some base level. Unsaturated fats are going to be better than saturated fats. It kind of comes down to the makeup of the fat on a cellular level. But basically just know the basics. Unsaturated fats break down much easier in the body and have much less LDL. LDL is the bad cholesterol. HDL is the good cholesterol. So unsaturated fats, low LDL, high LDL. Saturated fats, they have high levels of both. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have any saturated fats, but just remember you want to kind of stick more towards the unsaturated fats. Saturated are going to have high in both. The worst of all, though, is trans fats. These are very low in the healthy cholesterol and very high in the bad cholesterol. So really just, if you can, stay away from trans fats. Those are going to be things like canola oil, very processed. Try to keep the majority of your fat sources coming from clean and whole foods. I really like things from meat, eggs, milk, nuts, things like avocados. These are just going to be the best. Now, another thing to keep in mind, you want to have a lot of omega-3s. So if you don't like things like, and omega-3s come in a lot of different food sources. The highest food source that's going to have omega-3, the food source that has the highest amount of omega-3 is things like fish, salmon. If you don't like fish, I strongly recommend getting a fish oil supplement just to make sure that you do have them. So remember, we do need fats. They are very important, and we don't want to get below a healthy range of fats for each day. Kind of play around with yours if you're making your own macros to find whether that is. I would start with 70. You can play with it up or down, kind of see how you feel. But that's pretty much it for the video. Any questions, let me know.